Ahoy! Welcome to another Commander deck tech. This time, I'm remaking an earlier video I did because it was shameful and the audio quality was bad. I intended to get this done a lot earlier, but it took so long that Kaldheim came out and then prices shifted, so I kept tweaking it. But without further ado, let's take a look at our commanders, because this time there's two of them. On the world of New Phyrexia, metal and flesh are interchangeable. Ich-Tekik, Chief Splicer of the Vicious Swarm, works tirelessly for Vorinclex to create the perfect predator. Given free rein to salvage parts from throughout the Tangle, he takes from both the living and the dead to augment his mindless golem as well as his own body. A 1/1 human artificer for 4 green, Ich-Tekik, Salvage Splicer, creates a 3/3 golem token when he enters the battlefield. Whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, we'll put a +1/+1 counter on Ich-Tekik and each golem we control. The deck will make good use of this, tearing our golem apart to make the others bigger. Our second commander is a pirate with a problem. He's far too big to fit on a boat. Insistent on being allowed to set sail, one foolish captain finally relented to his begging and threats, only for it to end exactly as you'd expect, leaving Dargo stranded on an island as the only survivor. While at first this maritime disaster seems like he's nothing but a big beater with trample, his unique casting ability allows him to really shine in combos that chain casting him over and over in order to take advantage of triggered abilities. A 7/5 giant pirate for a staggering 6 red, Dargo the Shipwrecker has an additional cost that allows us to sacrifice artifacts or creatures to reduce the cost of the spell by 2. Every artifact or creature sacrificed earlier in the turn will also reduce the cost by 2. This ability will allow us to chain casting Dargo over and over in a single explosive turn when set up properly, but if need be, a 7/5 commander is quite formidable. The deck focuses primarily on Ich-Tekik, with Dargo as more of an afterthought. I've even thought Rebek might be better and would allow you to play the other Splicers as well as Cavalier of Dawn. But I've been brewing this up as a Gruul deck for so long that I'm going to stick with Dargo regardless. The goal of this deck is simple. Create an army of giant robots and turn them sideways. Every golem we lose will make the others bigger. And with things like Dread Statuary and Guardian Idol, we'll even have cards that aren't usually creatures ready to get a body and soak up all the counters from a board wipe. Ich-Tekik himself doesn't have any evasion, but can become quite a beater, threatening commander damage kills. There are also a handful of payoffs for playing high-cost spells and having massive creatures. We want to go tall and wide, and the slimmer our opponents make us, the taller we'll get. Though the deck is top-heavy enough that we might need a while to set up with mana enablers. Speaking of which, let's go over some of the more notable ways we'll get there. I've already mentioned Guardian Idol and Dread Statuary, but anything in the Mindstone, Hedron Archive, Dreamstone Hedron line will also be good. When we run out of the need for mana, we'll be able to crack them for a card draw, and more importantly to pump up our Golem and our Commander. Primal Growth will do the same if we pay the kicker cost by sacrificing an artifact creature. We're also going to use plenty of creature-based ramp that takes advantage of the size of our spells. Gilanra, Caller of Wirewood for instance, will get us a card every time we cast a spell with converted mana cost 6 or greater. Or, I guess with Strixhaven, I'm going to have to get used to calling it mana value. We've got 15 cards with mana value of 6 or greater, as well as one X spell. Leafkin Avenger and Elena Kessish Trapper, on the other hand, will give us buckets of mana for having bigger creatures. For Leafkin Avenger, we'll get green for each creature we have with power 4 or greater, while Elena will give us red, equal to the greatest power among creatures that entered the battlefield this turn. And that's current power, not just the power they had when they entered. There are a few times where we'll be able to double spell just off of that mana alone. I'm not quite done with mana yet. Next up are two similar cards, Rish Kar, Pima Renegade, and Zhang Yanggu, Wildcrafter. Both put counters on creatures, but more importantly they make it so that creatures that have +1/+1 counters tap for mana. Green for Rish Kar, and any color for Yanggu. With all the counters we'll be throwing around, that should definitely come in handy. Still not quite done with getting to play our big spells, we're throwing in some cost reduction. Foundry Inspector and Joyous Familiar will reduce the cost of our artifact spells, while Joyous Familiar will also reduce the cost of the legendary creatures and planeswalkers the deck has. Speaking of which, Ugin the Ineffable is exceptionally good in this deck, reducing all colorless spells by 2. Almost half the deck is colorless, so you can see why I agonized about spending $4 of my budget on him. But that benefit is too good to pass up in such an artifact-heavy deck, especially with the added bonus of being able to destroy most permanents or gain card advantage. Last for enablers, we'll also be running Conduit of Ruin, another card I agonized over whether or not to cut. It will reduce the cost of the first spell we cast in a turn by 2, but it has the added benefit of tutoring a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater to the top of our library when we cast it. We've only got 6 of those, but they're 6 of our best cards, so hopefully it's worth it. Long ago, the Jewish residents of Prague had a problem: anti-Semitic violence. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So, Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel went to the banks of the Vltava River to create a man of clay who had comic book superpowers like being able to turn invisible or summon the spirits of the dead to aid him. This superhero protected the Jews of Prague from pogroms. Then, D&D just used the term for generic enemies, so now we're playing card games with fantasy robots. Our motives aren't quite as noble as Rabbi Loew's, but before we get to the real golem, it's worth going over some of the more malleable pieces of clay, which is to say, changelings. We're going to be running a lot of them. There are probably just enough decent golem, especially if we were running white instead, that we wouldn't need to, but you can never have too many tribal creatures. So that's why we'll be running Masked Vandal and Bloodline Pretender. Although if you want to spend the extra money, you could also go for Chameleon Colossus or Taurian Mauler, which gets its own counters, though so does Bloodline Pretender. There's also the honorary changeling, Adaptive Automaton, though I decided not to run that because I'm already stretching the budget. Then we'll be running Birthing Boughs and the much better Maskwood Nexus, which will let us spit out a new golem whenever we please. Maskwood Nexus has the added benefit of turning every creature in our deck into a golem, as well as everything else. It's so good that I chose it over Realmwalker, which is another great changeling for a tribal deck of any kind. Now, we're finally on to the real golem. Ginger Brute is an unlikely start to the deck, but this little cookie is a golem. Being nearly unblockable for only 1 mana is pretty useful, especially when it starts getting bigger. But even better is the fact that we can sacrifice it as food. 3 life is nice, a counter for every golem we control is nicer. Similarly, an evasive little shit is Iron Bully. I wasn't really sure whether to put it in or not, but I know that I've underestimated Menace in the past. Howling Golem is a card draw for everyone at the table, while Lodestone Golem is a bit less friendly. Hopefully, reducing non-artifact spells by 1 hurts us the least, since most of this deck is silver. Ancestral Statue is another card that I'd probably cut if it were just a little more expensive. When it enters the battlefield, we have to bounce another permanent, but there are many times when we'll actually want that, especially when it comes to cascade triggers, but that's for later. Voltaic Construct will let us untap most of our creatures for 2 mana, and it's repeatable. We don't have any tapping or untapping shenanigans, but giving some of our bigger creatures pseudo-vigilance is worth it on its own. I'm going to skip over a few of the golem, but first I want to mention Vital Splicer and Maul Splicer. They're both 1/1 green human artificers, and each comes into play with a golem token, or 2 in the case of Maul Splicer. Giving our massive creatures trample or regenerating them for 1 is definitely going to be handy. They're also great targets for bouncing with Ancestral Statue. Golem Artisan will also help us get damage through by letting us pay 2 to give a golem +1/+1, trample, haste, or flying. Bosch Iron Golem is where we start getting into the top end of our deck. It will also allow us to instant speed sack an artifact to deal damage equal to its mana value right to someone's face, or to take out one of their creatures. And, of course, doing so will pump up the team. It's also repeatable. Then we've got one of those cascade cards, Maelstrom Colossus. When we cast it, we'll reveal the top of our library until we hit a card with mana value 7 or less and then cast that card. Colossus Vakros is a beefy 10/10 with Defender that becomes a beefy 20/20 with Trample when we pay 10. And while we can't afford Eldrazi Titans, I did squeeze in a statue of Kozilek, or at least Kosi the Trickster. Ancient Stone Idol is a whopping 12/12 that can likely flash in for free, then becomes a rolling head once it dies. Unfortunately, the head is a construct and not a golem, which seems like an incredibly arbitrary distinction to me. And last of the golem I'm going to bother going over is our biggest threat, Thyrexian Triniform, a one-man army in a can. Right off the bat, this is a 9/9 golem for 9, but when the Triniform dies, it does its best attempt at showing up Wormcoil Engine, breaking apart into 3/3/3 golem tokens. As if 18 power from one creature wasn't enough, it also has Encore for 12, meaning at sorcery speed we can pay 12 and exile it from our graveyard to create a token for each opponent we control. Each copy will have that opponent locked into their sights and has to attack them if able. And then, at the end of the turn, those tokens will be sacrificed. Those 3/9/9s will then break apart into 3/3/3 golem tokens each. If we can encore the Triniform while we still have 3 opponents, we'll swing at each of them for 9 and then get 27 power in tokens afterwards. And each time things get sacrificed, Ich-Tekik will trigger, meaning the tokens that come into play after the Triniforms die will see the death triggers and those tokens will get +1/+1 counters. I'm not even going to attempt to do the math for that, but feel free to tell me in the comments if you figure it out. Now, let's go over a few ways to protect these giant robots from our opponents. Domri Raid may be a little shit who really needs to read Bookchin, but Domri and Cap of Bolas will make sure any spells we play are protected from counter magic. The bonus to power and the ability to fight another creature aren't shabby either. Pious Revolution will let us return any artifact of ours that dies to our hand, unless an opponent of our choice pays 3. Great to make a deal with someone and have them not pay so we can get our stuff back, like some much needed ETB removal. Duretti, Scrap Savant's ultimate will do the same, though he's also got a +1 that lets us wheel 2 cards or swap an artifact in our graveyard for one on the battlefield. Similarly, Arcbound Reclaimer will let us spend +1/+1 counters to stack the top of our deck with an artifact from our graveyard. Blossoming Defense will let us protect one creature, while Rapid Vigor will protect them all. Inspiring Call will make everything with a +1/+1 counter invincible, which should be everything. It'll also net us a card for each creature with a +1/+1 counter. While we do want our creatures dying, we also want some control over when that happens, which is why Slow Bad Goblin Tinkerer is so useful. We can trade one artifact's life for another, sacrificing one to give the other indestructible, and of course to get death triggers from Ich-Tekik. Now we're going to play a little bit of Gremlin ourselves, mostly by removing our opponent's creatures. The girlfriend of Elena from earlier, Halana, Kessish Ranger, will let our big creatures throw punches, if we pay 2 when they enter the battlefield. Spine of Ish-Sa and Meteor Golem will outright destroy a permanent, and Spine of Ish-Sa will even function as a great sacrifice target since it comes back when it gets destroyed. There's also Calm the Ambush and Kazul's Fury, which are both spells and lands. One of the best pieces of removal we have is going to be Indomitable Creativity, which lets us destroy X artifacts or creatures and then wheel them into something else. While using them on our opponents is good, the best part is that we can blow up our own shit, flip a new golem, and then the new golem will get the death triggers from the artifacts we just blew up. Every deck needs a few pet cards, and this one isn't any different. I was tempted to throw in Aetherworks Marvel and Gonti's Aetherheart, but instead I just went with Ugin's Nexus, which is a great thing to blow up with Indomitable Creativity. Keep in mind though that Ugin's Nexus exiles itself, so we won't be getting any dies triggers from it, but I think an extra turn makes up for that. I also threw in See the Unwritten, to dig down and grab a few creatures for free, though since this is put into play, it won't trigger Maelstrom Colossus. Speaking of which, another great sack outlet happens to be Ingenuity Engine, which cascades out a card with mana value 6 or less and lets us sacrifice an artifact to return an artifact to our hand. While we definitely can return Ingenuity Engine itself to play it over again, we can also save a golem we don't want to lose, or one we want to cast again, like Maelstrom Colossus or Meteor Golem. You could also throw in Saheeli's Artistry or Genesis Wave here if you want, though one is a lot more expensive than the other. Molten Echoes is also a fun card, and it can even help with sacrificing Dargo. Oh, right, Dargo is here too. Like I said, I sort of left Dargo as an afterthought. He really could be better served in a deck built around him, and I should have swapped over to Rebek or Akiri, but I was too entrenched. The trick to Dargo is that if he gets sacrificed, he'll cost 2 less the next time you cast him. Commander tax is 2 more each time, so the 2 cancel out. If you sacrifice 3 artifacts or creatures and paid only red to play Dargo, you'll be able to sacrifice him and then play him again for only red. Keep doing that as long as you've got red mana and you can keep getting ETB triggers. The obvious way to do this would be with Phyrexian or Ashnod's altars, but since this is budget and Dargo is the red-headed stepchild, we're going with makeshift munitions, which is also good for getting Ich-Tekik triggers. To make use of all these times we recast our commander for 1 red, we're going to use Warstorm Surge, which can also be a great way to throw out damage with all of our giant robots. Getting Dargo to die and return over and over will slap someone with 7 damage, 8 with the one from makeshift munitions. In a more dedicated deck, we could focus almost entirely on this kind of combo, but I prefer to go with green artificers. Anyway, time for the lands. More than usual, there are a lot of colorless lands, which will hopefully not be much of a problem. Buried Ruin and Sequestered Stash will help us get artifacts back from the graveyard. Shrine of the Forsaken Gods and Temple of the False God will give us double mana once we meet the conditions, though with Temple of the False God we'll get nothing unless we do. Tomb of the Spirit Dragon will get us 1 life for each colorless creature we control, which conveniently enough most of ours are. This is the deck I'm most interested in playing from all the ones I've brewed up lately. The concept of a green artifact deck is just so good to me. It's quirky, but I think there are just enough Golem to make it work, even without trying for silly things like Straw Golem or Crumbling Colossus. And now for the credits. If you made it this far, I'd like to thank you. Part of this is me trying to get comfortable with my voice, so if you're listening this far, that means you probably put up with it. If you enjoyed this, I'd appreciate it if you gave me a like and maybe shared the video, and maybe leave a comment too. I won't ask anyone to subscribe. Who knows what content I'll do next. I've got a video talking about an SCP article I love, and I usually write essays about video game, politics, and themes. But I do want to do more Magic decks, since I can't play at the moment, what with the plague. I've got one up right now that's for Lycia, Sanguine Tribune, that focuses on controlling its life total. I'd also like to thank the people whose names you see on the screen, who support me on Patreon. If you like this or any of my other stuff enough that you'd like to support me on Patreon, or with a simple donation, that'd be great of you. You can find links to that and my other work down in the description, along with the deck list, but if not, just leaving a comment about the deck would help a lot.